Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, where we help you manage your growing engineering team. Through expert interviews, we help you navigate the challenges of leading, hiring, growing, and nurturing your tech team to deliver the value your customers demand. Brought to you by agilityfeet.com, experts in staffing engineering teams in Latin America for clients globally.
Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, the podcast for leaders of growing software engineering teams. I'm Arin here with my co-host, David Alfaro. David, today is another milestone day for the Scaling Tech Podcast. This is our 20th episode, so the end of another 10-episode season. What do you think about this milestone that we've hit?
Well, I have shared this with you offline. It's like we are finding our voice.
Yeah.
I think that we have to congratulate us for the consistency. We are gaining experience. We are improving. And the good thing is that once you reach 20 episodes, you are demonstrating traction and reliability, and that is good for attracting more guests and to keep pushing. I mean, I can say already, all the guests that we had so far, they are outstanding. And I am particularly grateful for the first guests because it's hard to trust a couple of guys that are going to start this, but they did, and I am very grateful. But thanks to them, now we are 20 now, and now to the next milestone.
Yeah,
100.
exactly.
Let's do it. 100. Let's do it.
Yeah, after 20 episodes of recording and editing these, and it seems like we're serious about this, David.
Looks like
it looks that way. So yeah, like you said, I'm also grateful to all of the guests that we've spoken with, the early ones especially, who were willing to take a chance talking with us, and that's certainly helped us in bringing in additional guests. And also grateful to everyone who's listened to the Scaling Tech Podcast and subscribed to it. I hope you'll also have seen a lot of value in these first 20 episodes and share that with your coworkers, with other engineering managers or aspiring engineering managers in growing tech teams, because we've really had a lot of wonderful guests on the Scaling Tech Podcast so far. And I know I've learned something from each and every one of them. So our tradition here is to pause on every 10th episode and do a little recap of what we've learned from our most recent guests. So as we've done before, we're going to play a little clip from each of our guests this season, covering episodes 11 through 19. And this is a clip that we thought was particularly meaningful from that episode. And we'll share some additional insights that we've had since recording that episode or about that conversation. So let's start with Trisha Rhodes from Single Stone Consulting, who joined us in episode 11 to discuss tech recruiting and employee experience.
Our recruiting philosophy for 25 years has been attitude, aptitude, and skills in that order. Mm-hmm. And we feel like individuals that have the right work ethic, that are open and honest communicators, that hold themselves and others accountable, those types of things are harder to teach, but we can teach you the skills, right? We can surround you with really talented engineers who can teach you how to be a talented engineer. The work ethic and the attitude, aptitude, that's a little bit harder. One thing, because I don't want to suggest that we're not interested or learning how to support less experienced developers better. Right. We're kind of right now experimenting with this +1 concept, which is something that's maybe a lot of larger firms can easily do, but we're doing now kind of for the first time, where if a developer comes to the team and they're newer and less experienced, we will pair them up with a senior engineer for, let's say, 8 to 12 weeks, and they will not be responsible for actually writing code, but they're responsible for sitting next to that other engineer, sitting next to them and kind of working alongside them every day. And I think I'm not an engineer, that whole pair programming concept. I think the difference for us is we take the delivery pressure off of that person. So it's like you get a ramp up time. You can learn.
I found this conversation with Trisha really interesting, and it certainly gets to the heart of the issue that we face with the talent scarcity problem. Also touches on an issue we've talked about in other episodes in the season about mentoring team members and onboarding team members. And so we have to find ways to recruit individuals with potential, but also then bring them up to speed on the skills that our specific organization needs, because the tech industry is changing so much so rapidly. And I think historically, larger firms perhaps did a better job with this, but because they had more capacity to build in good onboarding and mentoring programs. But it's equally important these days for smaller firms to do that as well, because of how hard it is to recruit really talented tech employees. So what did you think about this conversation with Trisha?
She's on point. And this happens to us all the time when we are bringing a new, or when we are talking with a new client, or with an existing client, and they need to fill a new job position, a new developer, and we go through the requirements of the position, and then we always have this moment where we determine a line of well, this will be ideal for the person to know, so we don't have to teach that to that new person. But definitely these core things are important, and we emphasize that part because the explosion of technologies and things, even though we try to target the kind of technologies that are more commonly used. So but still, I mean, there are libraries, all that combination of things. So we try to target the core things that the person has to know, and then we switch to the attitude. Once that we have the certainty that the person has the right attitude and it is ambitious, because the person wants to grow in knowledge, wants to do it, because that part is important. I mean, there are in fact developers that don't want to grow,
right?
But if we find the right person, and that person means, and being the right person means is thirsty to grow, to learn new things, then we can have a very good confidence that the person is going to do a great job. So I agree. I mean, she is fantastic explaining that part. Something that she does particularly well during this episode is emphasizing something that we have seen works, is that she talks about creating a positive candidate experience throughout the recruiting process. She is on point on that as well. I mean, right now the candidates have so many options that an important point that they take into account is how pleasant the recruitment, how pleasant, concise was the recruiting process. They take that into account, and I haven't seen anyone discussing that the way that she did. So that's why I think it was a wonderful episode as well.
Yeah, it was a really, really wonderful conversation, and I enjoyed it. And I agree with you completely that really tells a candidate a lot about the company that they're being hired into, that they're going to work with, what that recruiting experience is like and that onboarding experience is like. Now, next up in episode 12, we spoke with Joanna Rothman, author of From Chaos to Successful Agile Distributed Teams. So let's go to a clip from Joanna.
Yeah, so how would you ideally have your clients design? If most of them started these hybrid and other models, if any model, very chaotically, right? So how would you ask them to design it now if they could restart?
So I would say, senior leadership, take your hands off the team. Just stop imposing work conditions on the team. Instead, have the team create working agreements about when and where they will work. Talk specifically about workshopping whatever you need to workshop, right? Do you need to workshop stories? Do you need to workshop roadmaps? Do you need to workshop how we will work together when we code and test? What
Mhm.
do we need to workshop? And then, do we need to do that in person in a collaborative way? Because while I am running all of my workshops remotely now, because it is so much better for the client, because I only work maybe 2 to 3 hours in a day, and then they have the rest of the time to practice. This is
Right.
so much better, so much more effective than what I did before when I flew into a place and was there for 2 or 3 days and I flew back out. This is so, so much more effective. So I have all these sticky cards and I have index cards and yellow stickies, and I don't know what I'm going to do with them all, but I'm not going to use them with clients. Right? That's not the best use of their time or my time. So when do we need to be in person? And what times of the day make sense for us?
Joanna's book has a lot of practical advice for how to structure remote teams and the importance of time zone overlap, a lot of other key concepts in building a remote, agile, distributed team. So, this is a great book to better understand those patterns. For instance, she talks about the nebula pattern and the cluster patterns. There's a lot of great specific advice in there in structuring the teams. But in addition to that aspect of structuring your teams, I also have to think about how the teams organize. And I really enjoyed this quote from her where she had stressed the importance of still letting the team self organize. So leadership can define the structure and location and purpose of teams in many ways, but how those teams work, in as is the case with agile teams, often is that they should be encouraged to self organize, and so still determine how they're going to work even in a remote fashion. And that, I think, is still a really important principle to keep in mind when working with distributed teams, that although we may have to be more prescriptive about some things in order to take into account the distributed nature of those teams, type of work that they're going to do, we still have to leave lots of room as leaders for the team to self-organize and how they perform that work. Just a lot of great comments from Johanna in this episode. What did you think, David?
She makes the observation that it is impossible for anyone to foresee what what are the all the possible scenarios that is going to appear in in the execution of a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
It is impossible. So even though you may be a very seasoned scrum master or product owner or leader, uh, the the fact of the matter is that every new project is um, a new combination of factors that will create an almost infinite combination of decisions to make. So trying to impose to the letter how a team is going to behave, it doesn't make sense. Um, you can bring your wisdom into that conversation, but at the end of the day, is what the team discovers with good facilitation itself,
Yeah.
And that connects with the thing that we talked with her, that uh, when choosing the methodology that should be used in her specific team, and that decision should be um, made taking into account the team's context and needs.
Mm-hmm.
And we have seen this, like for our product development teams, Scrum is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, at some point, the team transitions to be more a support team, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe the team membership changes, and at that point, now Kanban makes more sense.
Sure. Yep.
So I think that the great value of the conversation we had with Joanna is that um, it's don't do context dropping in making decisions.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciated all of the wisdom that Joanna brought to us in that conversation. And so, yeah, definitely recommend checking out episode 12 with her. Now, in episode 13, we continued to talk about remote teams, but in this episode, we particularly focused on culture in distributed teams with Gustavo Rossetti, author of Remote, Not Distant. How do you balance that? I mean, if you have, say, a technical team that just did a big release to production, hopefully not too big if they're an agile team, but they did a release to production. It didn't go well. There were lots of defects. They've been cleaning up afterwards. How do you work through something like that in a blameless way?
The important thing, starting from a broader picture, is that the culture, as we've been talking about, and going back to David's question, culture is a system, right? And usually, when something goes wrong in a company, people look at the individual. So, who screw up, rather than what in the system allow people to do that mistake, or encourage people to think that that was the right decision, or encourage people to take a shortcut. Because sometimes we say, hey, we need to do great QA, but also we say, hey, we need to deliver this faster because of investors' pressure. We need to show up them so we get more money, and then we cut corners and then we screw up. So I think the biggest important thing is focus on the system. That doesn't mean that some people are going to screw up, but usually companies penalize the many for the mistakes of a few. So basically, one person screw up, and then they create a rule, and everyone's going to get like a punish for that. There are things moving from I to you, no? So the conversations usually when we say, I got my, I had to do the quality assessment, but then you bring your part to me too late in the game. If I say you did it, then it becomes blame rather than because someone sent the software that I need to review too late in the game, I wasn't able to go through the whole process as accurately as I should have. So then you start saying, okay, what happened in the system? You go back to the process, you go back to behaviors, you move from emotions, you move away from people, and try to focus on, okay, what can we fix moving forward? No? So I think the relationship with blame also has to do with the leader of the team. No? So as a leader, when your team screw up, are you encourage them with questions to try to uncover? Do you promote curiosity or do you promote finger pointing?
I think this is such a hard skill for engineering managers to become good at. Engineering teams need a certain amount of psychological safety in their team culture in order to properly balance fear and risk. I mean, when the shit hits the fan, executives may be ready to bang some heads together until things are fixed. And fighting that fire is certainly the top priority. But after the fire is out, engineering leaders need to find a way to learn from the mistakes that led to that fire without killing a culture of technical creativity, without killing that psychological safety that needs to exist in a creative technical team. What did you think about this conversation with Gustavo, David?
Well, I mean, if you remember, I was very insistent on, hey, give me a definition of culture,
Right.
because we talked about that left and right, and um, uh, and even though I didn't say this in the episode, the great conclusion I came up about what is an interesting definition about culture is the sum of the intellectual um, achievements in a company. And intellectual in this case means also values. I mean, values are concepts uh, that you understand are good for the company and good for everyone. And in that sense, uh, what we just saw in that clip is a key part of a culture. Is this is not a place to finger pointing. This is a place for finding the way to improve the system.
Yeah.
Um, and that is so important. I mean, but but what I want to emphasize is the part regarding to culture. And he said something very important. And culture, I mean, that the goal should be moving from a culture by chance to a culture by design.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that you sit down and think about what is important to have in this culture that we're creating for the company. In that way, we are going to achieve a good work-life integration, um, and finding opportunities to always improve the system. Um,
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think for me that is, that's something of a theme of this group of episodes of this season for me is that um, how conscious we have to be in the
right,
design of
right,
systems,
right,
right? Of
right,
people systems, essentially. Culture is going to happen whether you want it to or not. But if you want it to be a specific culture or a good culture, then you need to be deliberate about it, right? Remote teams are going to happen whether you want them to or not these days. Team change is going to happen whether you want it to or not these days. So it's a matter of how do you be deliberate about that in order to make sure that it benefits the organization as well as creating a nice place for people to work too. So I think that's really important. Uh, and speaking of where things can go wrong, in episode 14, we talked, probably ruffled a few feathers in this conversation, I would think, because we talked about where Agile has gone wrong. We talked with my old friend Bob Payne about, has Agile lost the plot?
But if we look back at the birthplace of Agile, and here I'm talking about the manifesto, um, built into the first thing is this idea that whatever process we're using has to be situationally appropriate for the problem we're solving and the people that are solving it. And everybody was experimenting and making up stuff, right? Ken and Jeff were making up stuff. Kent and company on the XP team were making up stuff. Alistair was maybe a little more ivory tower, but he was making up things and trying experiments and seeing what worked. And we learned that lesson starting in the 40s and 50s with Lean. Like, I often joke that if Taiichi Ono came back from the dead, we got two problems. Zombie apocalypse problem is real. and he would look at the current Toyota production system and say, wow, this is completely different. There's still some core ideas about flow and just in time, reducing variability and reducing the water line that he would recognize, but the processes and tools would be completely different. And I think because we, and I'll include myself in that, and the creators of these methods wanted to sell them to make a nice living for ourselves and to help teams out in the meantime, became very attached to processes, to the individual processes. And we forgot the experimentation part. It's empirical process control is built into Scrum, and yet very few Scrum teams change their process. They'll tweak it a little bit, but they don't fundamentally wander off the ranch. And I think that was the moment agility stopped being agile. And the reason the manifesto came to be is all of these people were doing things differently, solving the problem in the best way that they could. And it's a sampling error that it happened to be all, software development folks. But Alistair said, hey, let's get together and let's learn about each other's methods, because they'd been kind of discussing it on that first wiki in the Portland Patterns repository. And they were all just making stuff up. And And as soon as we stopped experimenting and investing any energy in sort of dogmatic adherence to a particular way of doing things, we lost the ability to innovate.
So over the last decade, I've been teaching this one-day seminar on agile methods for the University of Virginia's MS in Management of IT program. We've talked a little bit about in the Scaling Tech podcast, and I always start the day's lesson with this exercise where teams compete by flipping coins in increasingly smaller batch sizes. And it's a fun way to teach them a few basic lean concepts around how important it is to work in small batch sizes, to iterate, measure value delivered to the customer. And at the end of this, we're less than an hour into a full day course. But I always tell the students, if you understand at this point the importance of working in small batch sizes and releasing to customers frequently, then congratulations, you're now agile. You don't have to pay attention the rest of the day, anything we're going to talk about in the next 7 hours, right? Because I'll spend the rest of the day still talking to them about the intricacies of how to do methods like Scrum and Kanban. But what we're really trying to help is to help them understand that those methods, they shouldn't be treated like a religion. They're just guideposts for agility. And so I wouldn't say I do that perfectly in teaching out, but certainly that sense of creativity and experimentation that is important to agile methods. When we talk with Bob, he talks about how that's been lost in a lot of the agile movement. And so I really enjoyed hearing his perspective about that. I think it's a good gut check for us, for all of us who have been you and I have been agile coaches in the past. But even now, as just engineering leaders who want their teams to work in agile ways, it's a good gut check for us to think about, are we trying to just do something by the book because that's the way the book says, or are we really thinking about agile principles, and are we willing to be creative in our implementation of them in order to have the actual type of agility and agile organizations, agile enterprises that we're trying to achieve? What did you think of our conversation with Bob?
Bob emphasized basically that the whole point of agile was to have a better way to understand reality. And basically, what has happened when it goes wrong is that it become a tool for rationalizing things instead of being a cognitive help to understand reality. That's why he says, well, the point was that, and the way to keep you grounded is to keep doing experimentation so you can have real factual data for you to use your strategic thinking about how to proceed, having this tool set that you can pick from. And from that tool set, you can to say, well, given the context I have, the reality I have, and given the principles I know that work, then I can pick this tool.
Right.
I mean, that process, but notice that it starts from the data I collect from the experiment.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Bob was an interesting guest, because he didn't mince words
Right.
about the problems that the agile community was facing. So it was good. It was a very critical discussion, but constructive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, by the end, he still, had a optimistic perspective of how we're still innovating in some areas. Brought up things like DevOps and stuff, and there's still potential for us to kind of get back to those core principles of Agile. But it's good to hear from someone who's been there, throughout the Agile movement, to really have that perspective and that history of where he's been along that whole trajectory of the agile movement and how to make sure that we don't go, we've gone a little bit off the rails. Let's not go too far off the rails. Let's bring it back to what's really important. So in episode 15, we spoke about an area that you and I have been a part of since the beginning too, a topic that you and I know really well, because it's what we've been doing with our development staff augmentation firm, Agility Feet, since 2011. We spoke about nearshoring with Kirk Laughlin, an industry expert and founder of nearshoreamericas.com.
I just feel like the arc or the direction that the IT world has gone in general favors those who can be nimble and, meet the business imperative. And it's all about accuracy and speed and agility. And those things all put the nearshore in an advantageous position against its so-called competitors worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kirk, when the nearshoring came about, specifically related to software development, it was clear that the main motivation behind that interest was savings.
Yeah.
At some point. Now, I would like to hear your thoughts and reactions to my observation lately. Is that still financial advantage is something that is still nearshoring is offering, specifically in software development. This is important that I clarify that. But what I'm seeing is that there is a motivation that at some point was very relegated to the bottom, now is gaining more relevance, which is talent scarcity. It's becoming absolutely difficult in the United States
No
to
question.
come up with it is. My prediction is that at some point, maybe not now, especially not this year, but at some point, I don't know, 20 years, something like that, or maybe less, the economic factor is not going to be the determining factor of going nearshore, but just finding talent. How do you think about that?
I think a lot of things, and I do think it's a bit destination influenced by the destination in terms of the intensity of the point you're making. I think there's no question the central point you're making about talent scarcity is super, super relevant, is always going to be a driver as long as that exists. But I still see that although there's a lot of claims that we're past the point of the economic thing, economic concerns or cost concerns being less relevant, I just think it's very hard to make that declaration, because I think so many enterprises and those who are making decisions are looking at a spreadsheet and are looking at real costs and the total cost of outsourcing and the expected value out of that. And it's a factor that we know exists and is still an influence. But, in places like Costa Rica, David, that clearly it's the most expensive place in Central America to do export software.
I don't hire in Costa Rica in my country anymore.
Right. Right. But yet the work is tremendous, right? There's so many great companies doing great work, and so many clients in the U.S. love to partner there.
So, David, I really enjoyed this conversation with Kirk. Obviously, Kirk and I are both from the United States, but we share an affinity for Latin America. And like you, we care deeply about the nearshoring market. So this was a great episode for our listeners to learn more about nearshoring in general, if they're not familiar with it. But in the clip I just played, you and Kirk also had some discussion around how much does price matter anymore in nearshoring. What are you thinking now, David? Does price still matter to U.S. companies who are nearshoring in Latin America, or are they just trying to solve their talent acquisition crisis. Because and even since we recorded this episode, and now we've seen quite a bit of layoffs at major tech companies in the U.S., and so the labor market is very dynamic right now for sure. What do you see currently?
Right. Well, I mean, from a macroeconomic perspective, what is going on is reality passing the check to the economy. Is like guys, you've been making a big party for 15 years, making up things that are not real. Now we are adjusting the market to the reality, and that's why we are seeing all these layoffs and a very complicated world situation from an economic point of view. But that still makes the point valid, because once the adjust is done, growth is going to continue. Mankind is going to keep doing new things. Products and values are created every day. So the strength that progress in the particularly in the technological field has is so much, is so big, that the trend towards rewarding more those that are more valuable is going to continue. Why? Because they are scarce. In fact, let me add this. In the last weeks, everyone has just mind blown by the capabilities that ChatGPT is providing, right? So I can see a future where a developer is going to be, I don't know, 100 times more productive maybe compared to what it is now, because it's having tools to to automate, to do things faster in a better way, and this and the other thing is that these developers are going to have huge visibility, and that's the point. In the past, a person that were highly talented, like let's say here in my country, in Costa Rica, it wouldn't matter how talented that person will be, but it was located in Costa Rica, so that person was confined to be a person that will earn way less than an American. But in the technology, in the information era that we are now, that is combining AI and huge visibility, the future is going to be way more favorable to them, and they will have great visibility. And it happens that after COVID, everyone discovered that it doesn't matter where you're located, you can be of great value to my company if you're a programmer. And we have seen situations like that in our case. We have people from Argentina and Brazil that they are earning the same salary than if they were living in the United States right now. That is happening in our company.
Yeah, it's happening globally. Yeah,
happening.
For sure.
And precisely, those are the least worried about losing their jobs.
Right.
So because first of all, the current company that is having them through us, they know that they cannot afford to lose them, number one. And second, if something happened and they lose their jobs, they will find maybe a better opportunity in a week, even though the economic conditions we have right now is still, even with these current conditions, something that I said before at the beginning is that I have to ensure I am providing a very nice interviewing recruiting experience, like if I were Disney.
Right.
Because even with, the more time that passes, the more concerned I am to present myself and our clients in the best possible and real version, right? I mean the best possible way. So we present ourselves attractive, and the process that we follow is attractive. That makes sense because that is a reflection of what they can. I mean, the reason that we are so worried about giving a great interviewing and recruiting experience is that that makes a strong association and truly a true and true association that the things that they will be doing in the company that we are bringing them in will be similar. I mean, concise, interesting, fun, and value oriented.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
and that's money.
Yeah, no, 100%. I agree completely. And you know, in there, you mentioned Chat GPT, which gives me a great segue to our next episode, episode 16, where we also discuss Chat GPT and cloud technology with the CTO advisor, Keith Townsend. So we spoke with Keith about a wide range of cloud infrastructure topics, including modernizing legacy infrastructure, and had an interesting discussion about the impact of AI on that field as well.
So if you think about the best cloud engineers, or at least the best cloud engineers and architects I know, they're a little seasoned. They cut their teeth in some form of data center technology, where whether they were previously storage experts or they were network experts, and they understand low level distributed system design from a data center cloud perspective. It's natural to their evolution as a professional. It is very difficult to grow that skill from nothing. If you don't know what the OSI model is, or you don't know the pain of deploying deduplicated storage for the first time, or disaster recovery practices and experiences, those things feed into being a full-rounded data center or cloud engineer. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that the path has now changed. Mm-hmm. Similar to, 30, 40 years ago, we had to do our own memory managers. And we had to make the transition to allowing the OS to manage memory versus us managing memory at the application. We lost the knowledge to do garbage collection and all of this process that's now that's now handled at the platform level. So your premise that AI and automation is going to solve some of these problems for us, I think I agree with you that it's going to your point, solve some of the problems, but there's going to be gaps. If you've used Chat GPT, it's an amazing general purpose thing that I can go in and say, hey, write me a script that says hello world, and it does it. Or I can go in and at some point and say, write me a cloud formation template for this or that application. Generically, it's going to get you kind of 80% there. The challenge is the other 20%, and you need deep expertise to get to the other 20%. So I agree with you. I'm a little bit worried, not about the present. Well, I am worried about the present. We'll get into kind of optimization of applications once I've either built them in the cloud, moved them to the cloud, and now they're no longer under maintenance. Where I see this being a serious problem is there's a hype cycle for an application in which we develop an application. It starts to earn a bunch of money. We build a team around that application. We build DevOps, CI/CD processes. We invest a lot. We're pushing 10 updates of the application a day. Then the application starts to fade in importance. Now we're pushing one update. Gets to the point that maybe an update every couple of months. Now it's just one of the thousands of apps that our organization supports and that application has matured to a point that it's now inefficient to run it on the cloud-based architecture that we built it on. It needs to be replatformed. Where are those engineers?
David, you brought up the discussion of the talent gap with Keith and how the skill sets needed for data centers is in rapid decline, but the industry is still shorthanded and looking for more talent around modern cloud infrastructure. Since we recorded this episode with Keith, have you had any additional thoughts about the impact of AI on software development and cloud infrastructure? It's changing so fast. It feels like things are really growing rapidly there, but people are still, really curious about how that's going to impact a wide range of industries. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, since then I've seen people that have very poor knowledge about programming, or not at all, building applications and deploying them in Apple Store using ChatGPT. So we are in a moment that it is very hard to predict. It's quite similar to a singularity where, I mean, it is hard to see the future. It's very hard to see. But the conversations that we had with Keith were around not necessarily the time frame, because that is hard to predict, although we can see that things are going faster than we thought. There is a consensus. But the conversation that we had was about the AI tools. The use of these tools is going to grow in the tech industry, and we saw a wide range of potential applications for these tools. I mean, from AI code reviews to production monitoring, AI really can help teams to automate many routine tasks and gain deeper insights into their systems. Keith, particularly, says something interesting. He predicts that these tools will continue to become more powerful and pervasive. I mean, it's going to become bigger in the role they play in our daily lives as technical persons, and the technical leaders will be able to take advantage of them. And that's the point that I want to emphasize here, is that instead of us, and this is important, is instead of programmers and tech leaders or executives or company founders like you and me, right? I mean, instead of being scared of AI, I think that the great message that we had at the end of that conversation was this: that it is our opportunity to take a competitive advantage of these tools in the years to come. If we are able to not to be afraid but just embrace them, we are going to be part of a huge wave of economic and wealth growth that is going to happen, and because that will happen. That will happen. And absolutely, people that are afraid of those changes and they don't want to learn and they don't have the ambition to grow, they will lose their jobs. That will be a reality.
Right.
So which part you choose to be?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think, you still, in the transition from travel by horse to travel by car, right? Travel was still there. You still had, but it was obviously things completely changed in how you performed that work, right? Yeah. And I think that's the sort of moment that we're in now. The software development, cloud infrastructure management, these things are still going to exist, but the way that we're going to perform that work is definitely in a period of big transition right now. And this is not the time to start a business making horseshoes, right? This is the time to think about the way we're going to, as you've said to me, like living in the future, thinking about the way that this work is going to be done in the future. Right. And so now in episode 17, we returned to the topic of remote teams, where we spoke with Chris Dyer, author of Remote Work. In particular, though, in this episode, we talked with him about remote leadership.
To be a good leader in a remote environment is remember that what you focus on grows. I'll say that again. What you focus on grows. So if you focus on trust, meaning I trust you to get your job done, not focus on where are you? Is your light green? How many hours have you worked? What do you, if I'm worried that you're not working, right? If you're focusing on that, guess what? That's going, problem actually is going to get worse because people are going to feel like you're micromanaging them, you're all over them, and they're going to, I don't know if you've ever seen those funny videos where like someone puts their mouse to a little vacuum, right? And it's moving around all the time. So it looks like they're always green on their thing. And so people find ways to like be passive aggressive teenagers if you're going to micromanage them. So you focus on trust, you focus on outcomes, you focus on what is success, what does a good job look like, and then let them go do it.
There were a lot of interesting tidbits for me in this episode with Chris. Chris talked about how to mentor the highest and lowest performers on your team, not so much the people in the middle. I thought that was really interesting. He talked about how he's used personality assessments to improve his hiring. That was definitely an insightful conversation for me as well. And the types of leaders that he likes to hire. But ultimately for me, what it all came down to in our conversation with Chris was this one quote we just listened to about what you focus on is what grows. So, for example, Chris talked about wanting to hire leaders who are very rigid about the big things and very flexible about the little things. And bad leaders are the opposite of that, right? They're very flexible about the big stuff, how that's done, but they're very, very rigid about how you do little things. They're micromanaging, right? And a good leader should not be like that. And that sort of aspect of leadership in general becomes even more important when you're a leader in a remote environment, because we do have to trust our teams and how they're going to do their work, how they're going to go about it. And so it's really important as leaders in a remote environment that we are focused on the big stuff, on making sure that the big objectives are being done, the values being delivered, and not micromanaging how it's completed or what time of day it's completed or anything along those lines. So I thought this was a really interesting conversation with Chris as well. What did you think, David?
The way I condensed that part of the conversation was like this. Something like this is you need accountability from the team so you can get productivity. Now, how to get accountability? And he said that, well, you need to build an environment of trust. An environment of trust that promotes three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. He said that. And in that way, you will end up having people that feel pride on the things they do, and they will like to they would like to accomplish more. But for that to function, still you need the role of a facilitator leader, where you are making sure that we are not wasting time, or we are not having meetings that have a structure that don't match with the problem or the issue that we want to address. And that's why he talked about the cockroach, the tiger, and tsunami meetings.
Yeah, I loved those.
Yeah, so it was a very I enjoyed that episode. It was a funny conversation, lots of wisdom from his part. I mean, practical wisdom. I mean, things he has built companies and he knows what he talks. But I love that part. I mean, is that in being deliberate in creating a remote work culture that encourages autonomy, mastery, and purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, another thing that we all know about teams is that they are constantly changing. In this case, it doesn't matter if you're working remotely or you're working in person. It also doesn't matter if you want your team to change or not. They're going to change anyways. It's just a reality of the world that we have to deal with. And we tackled that difficult reality in episode 18 with Heidi Helfand, author of Dynamic Reteaming. So I want to just briefly touch on one of the anti-patterns that you mentioned in the book that I found very interesting. And you called it a reteaming to spread high performance. And there's a story in there talking about a case where it was negative, a bad thing for a team to take a team of high performers and spread them around to try to spread knowledge, which I thought was very interesting because it challenges some assumptions I have that would usually be a good thing. When is it a good idea? When is it a dangerous idea to take a team of high performers and spread them around?
Yeah, that was John's story in the book, and he regretted what he did, and he says that in there. And I remember this, and he thought the way that I could, like, this one team, they were jamming, they were delivering this stuff. It was an enjoyable experience. It was like the vibe was like an amazing team experience. Like, sounds like one of the, like, if you look back on your career and you were working with those teams and you were like, you didn't want it to end. It was just almost magical. And he's like, well, I wanted this for these other teams also. So I thought I'll just take people out of here and pretty much kind of destroyed the dynamic and kind of destroyed that feel that it did the opposite of what he wanted. Now, so he personally was like, I regretted that. And then, I got 3 teams and they were okay. But I found that to be an interesting story that he told me, because it was like, all right, well, what else could he have done besides reteaming in that case? Like, maybe, like, one way that I think is great to share stories of awesome teams is something that many of us do anyway. You have a lunch and learn, or you have some kind of event where someone from that team is talking about what they do. Maybe it inspires another team. Maybe you could I wouldn't add more than one. Maybe you could use the switching pattern from the book. Add one person into that team, kind of see what it's like. Maybe they stay. Maybe then they go back and share what they learned and, use that in their team. There's some research that's probably cited in this book about how if you switch for a short amount of time and then you go back, that benefits your team. It's research from Cornell or something. But yeah, there's like different things to try. Could it have worked? I don't know. John's story is John's story, and it didn't work. Could it have worked for another one? I don't know. But I really, really, I wouldn't chance it, and I wouldn't bust up a team that was doing really, really well. So I'm not saying like change your teams, use these patterns, go for it. It's more like, what challenges are you facing? Well, here's some levers to consider. And it's going to be hard, but here's some tools to help you kind of learn from it.
We talked a lot in this episode with Heidi about different reteaming scenarios when a team is growing dramatically, as well as when an organization is downsizing and how that affects the people who remain. But this part of the conversation with Heidi, the clip we just listened to, was perhaps my favorite, where Heidi proposed some ways to spread knowledge beyond a team of high performers without breaking up that team. And I particularly like this idea behind the switching pattern. So what did you think about this conversation on dynamic reteaming with Heidi Helfland?
That specific example was brilliant, because when you think in those terms, I have this great team. I mean, this team is hyper performing. So, if I split them in 3, obviously the 3 of them will be
3 great teams.
Right? Like if we were bacteria in a petri dish.
Right.
I mean, that is missing the entire essentiality of why these guys are hyper performing.
Right.
And
right.
and that's why she said, well, I mean, there are other patterns. I mean, that one, the ground split is like bacteria. I mean, is one. But
sure.
One pattern. But there are others that you could use that allows you to experiment to see which one could help you, which one could give you the best result at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Sorry, go ahead.
The thing I told her is that I was so engrossed about this because I've never stopped to think about the importance of reasoning about reteaming. The reasoning about reteaming is like, and this is a pattern that I've seen in our guests. I mean, they are reasoning about a specific angle of a growing organization that most people are not taking into account. So that's why I am so excited about these topics, because this is good.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of great information in her book, Dynamic Reteaming. And so, yeah, now we come to the end of this season. And after a season that was already full of excellent guests and conversations, I think we really brought it all home in episode 19 with a wonderful conversation with Will Larson, author of Staff Engineer and An Elegant Puzzle.
The thing that I saw a lot is someone who's a senior engineer. They're like, I don't like working with other people. I just want to put my head down and write software. And I want to get promoted for it. And I want to get paid more for it. And I want there to be kind of uncapped growth for me personally, but I don't want to work with other people. I just want to be really productive. And the thing I really wanted to emphasize with this idea is that there are very meaningful growth paths for people to be non-managers and have huge impact on companies, but they don't look that way. And so what I wanted people to understand is that if they want to continue going forward, it's not just being a more senior engineer who puts their head down and does the work that they find the most energizing and fun. It's like usually people problems in different forms, and they're not managerial problems. It's not giving out performance ratings. It's not running a calibration. It's not, figuring out an org structure, but they are fundamentally people problems. So a good example, we talked about changing infrastructure and how if you change the kind of the interface exposed by moving from my Postgres RDS to an early Cassandra, you can't build the same products. And so like a real problem a staff engineer might work on is infrastructure wants to move to this more scalable database. Product wants to ship products and can't build the products they think they need on that database. What do you do? And so that is a technical problem, but it's also like a deeply people centric problem as well. And there's no way to do it by just solving it without talking to people.
So David, this conversation with Will covered a lot of ground, and yet there was a whole lot more ground I would have liked to cover as well. There's a lot of great advice in his books, things that, as I think I said in the episode, I wish I had 15 years ago in my career. Lots of insights there that would have been really helpful about how teams can be formed. We talked about the mix of growing teams between like mentoring and promoting internally versus hiring externally, keeping that like a 50-50 mix. We talked about how good leaders come into a new team, into a new organization when they're hired in, and they should be focused on listening and learning rather than a lot of times a new engineering leader coming into an organization tries to put their stamp on the organization, maybe by replacing and, destroying some things, pushing some people out, right? We talked about the lack of self-awareness that a lot of times people in those roles may have. So there's so much great stuff in an elegant puzzle about engineering management in general. And then also towards the end, we brought it back to the staff engineering roles and thinking about how the paths that someone can take in their career if they want to stay purely technical, but they still want to advance in title and compensation and how they can increasingly contribute to the organization. And I just found everything about this conversation really interesting. What did you think?
It's a valid conversation. As I said in the episode, we've been almost 15 years in the market and we've seen people growing. I mean, really. And I want to mention but we have very nice experiences where we found people just wishing to have an opportunity to have a remote work for an American company in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Paraguay, and from that position growing to be um, key members, key members in the productivity that we provide to our clients, key members. So the point is always, okay, what's next? And this connects to the first episode, because in the first episode is about the experience. It's like, I mean, when you are recruiting people, the most of the time they are thinking, yeah, but what is the career path if I commit to you? So it is full circle now. So and it happens that the reason is so interesting to me is that it happens that in in my experience is most software engineers that we are dealing with, they are not so interested in the managerial part of it. I mean, they are not so interested in becoming in stop doing programming or the technical part. They want to keep doing the technical part, but they haven't articulated what will be to grow from there. Um, yeah, I mean, if you want to stay as a programmer but you want to grow, that's a that's an interesting conversation, right? Like how we can accomplish it, and all that conversation that we have with him was um, sorry, with Will, was about how to address that. What are the possibilities that the industry is allowing to developers like this? And in fact, there
Yeah.
are possibilities. Uh, and again, as we've seen with other guests, the trick in this is set the correct expectations based on
Hmm.
what the reality of the market is telling you and what is available. If
Yeah.
you do that, things are going to be okay because you're being honest.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I hate to be honest here and the bearer of bad news, but we're at the end of our time here in this recap episode, but the end of our 20th episode of the Scaling Tech podcast, of our second season of it. Any final thoughts you want to share before we wrap up?
Well, the first one is how will we use ChatGTP to to make podcast easier and higher quality and higher quality uh, for everyone. That's for sure something I'm gonna think.
Right. Maybe by season 3 of this, we will be two synthetic voices talking to
Right.
each other, and you and I won't even be involved. We'll see.
Something is gonna change for sure. And again, it is a singularity. I still don't know how, but
Right.
definitely we are going to experience a change in the next 20. I mean, from now on, uh, definitely I can see uh, an interest in our part. I mean, from your part and our part to think higher level, to think higher about how to grow a company, and we've touched very important points, very important angles to take into account when I mean, like he should make a book about these things. So that will
We
be
may.
uh, and and this is just the beginning.
Yeah, it is just the beginning. And as you've reminded me before, David, we're not done yet.
We're not that
So we're not done yet. I'm very proud that you and I have reached this milestone of 20 episodes, but we've got more coming. In fact, by the time this episode goes live, we will already have started recording with our season 3 guests. And so after a short vacation, we'll start publishing those episodes too. So there's also still time for you to suggest topics and guests for us. Just go to scalingtechpod.com to make your suggestions. And while you're there, you can revisit our past episodes. So don't go anywhere. Stay subscribed to the Scaling Tech Podcast. And before you know it, we'll be back with more fresh interviews with engineering management experts and further discussions with some of our past guests, probably too. So thanks for joining us for another season of the Scaling Tech Podcast. We're not done yet, David.
No, not yet.
Thanks for joining us on the Scaling Tech Podcast, where we help you manage your growing engineering team. Brought to you by agilityfeet.com, experts in staffing engineering teams in Latin America for clients globally. For more information on today's episode and to submit your ideas for future guests, please visit scalingtechpod.com.